Alexander Pichushkin was born on April 9, 1974 in Moscow, Russia, during the final decades of the Soviet Union. His arrival into the world seemed unremarkable. One of millions of children growing up in the gray, controlled environment of Soviet-era housing blocks. But behind the walls of those concrete apartments, his life was far from ordinary. Alexander's childhood began with a wound that would shape his psychology for years to come: abandonment. His father, an alcoholic who struggled to hold steady work, left the family when Alexander was just a baby. This sudden absence left his mother, Nadezhda, to raise him alone. From the very beginning, Alexander grew up without a stable male role model. The void created by his father's departure was never filled, and it silently carved a scar on his developing mind. As a small child, Alexander seemed like many others in Moscow. He played outside in the courtyards of his neighborhood, climbed stairwells, and watched older children play soccer. But those who observed him closely noticed differences. He was quieter, more withdrawn, and often struggled to connect with other children. His mother tried her best to provide for him, but the weight of single motherhood in Soviet Russia was heavy, and Alexander often felt emotionally neglected. At the age of 4, tragedy struck in a way that would alter the trajectory of his life forever. While playing on a swing, Alexander was pushed forward with tremendous force. The swing's wooden seat slammed into the back of his head, causing a traumatic brain injury. He lost consciousness and was rushed to the hospital. Although he survived, the damage was permanent. Doctors noted that Alexander had sustained an injury to the frontal lobe of his brain, an area responsible for impulse control, decision-making, and emotional regulation. The boy who emerged from the hospital was no longer the same. Friends and family began to notice drastic changes in his personality. He became more aggressive, more irritable, and less able to control his outbursts. Small frustrations could spark sudden fits of rage. This injury marked the beginning of Alexander's descent into social isolation. Other children, sensing something different about him, began to avoid him. Teachers grew frustrated with his inability to concentrate or follow rules. He developed a stutter that made communication even more difficult. Instead of receiving long-term support, Alexander was treated like an outcast. The system failed to recognize the growing storm within him. But amid this darkness, there was one light in his early years: his grandfather. Alexander moved in with his grandfather for a period of time, and the older man recognized that the boy needed direction. His grandfather introduced him to the game of chess. It was in the careful arrangement of pawns, knights, and bishops that Alexander found an escape from the chaos of his inner world. Chess became more than just a game. It became a symbol of structure, power, and intelligence. Everything he lacked in his real life. For Alexander, the chessboard was a universe he could control. Each piece moved according to strict rules, unlike the unpredictable people around him. He studied the strategies of masters and immersed himself in the logic of the game. For a brief time, chess gave him purpose. But his grandfather's influence extended beyond the chessboard. The old man encouraged Alexander to fight back against bullies, telling him that if someone insulted him, he should respond with violence. This advice, though meant to toughen the boy, only reinforced Alexander's growing aggression. He learned that control and dominance could be achieved through force. Unfortunately, this fragile source of stability did not last. When his grandfather passed away, Alexander was devastated. The one person who seemed to understand him, who had given him discipline and attention, was suddenly gone. Without him, Alexander felt abandoned once again. He moved back in with his mother, but the household was cold and distant. By his teenage years, Alexander was drifting. He lacked close friends and was often described as a loner. While other boys dreamed of careers, sports, or girls, Alexander's thoughts turned inward. His fascination with chess deepened, but alongside it grew darker obsessions. He began to imagine scenarios of control that extended beyond the chessboard. Killing small animals gave him a disturbing sense of power. He watched with curiosity how life could be ended with a single act. This was not unusual for serial killers in their early stages. Many begin with cruelty toward animals, testing boundaries, and seeking the thrill of domination. For Alexander, each act was a small step toward something far greater. Neighbors recalled him as strange, someone who didn't smile often, and who seemed perpetually lost in thought. He lacked the normal teenage connections that might have steered him toward a healthier path. Instead, the isolation festered, and his inner world became a breeding ground for violent fantasies. As the 1980s drew to a close, the Soviet Union was collapsing. The streets of Moscow were changing rapidly. Crime was rising, poverty was spreading, and institutions that once held strict control were breaking down. For Alexander, these turbulent times became a backdrop to his own transformation. He was no longer just the boy who loved chess. He was becoming someone who believed that life and death could be treated like pieces on a board, calculated, controlled, and discarded at will. By the time he reached adulthood, Alexander Pichushkin had already begun his silent journey toward becoming one of Russia's most infamous killers. His childhood had laid the foundation: abandonment, brain injury, social rejection, and an obsession with power. What remained was only the question of when he would make his first move. And soon, the world would find out. As Alexander Pichushkin entered his teenage years, the world around him was changing just as rapidly as the world inside him. Moscow in the 1980s was a city of concrete apartment blocks, crowded schools, and the heavy shadow of Soviet rule. Yet, even among millions of children raised in this environment, Alexander stood out. He was different in his behavior, in his thinking, and in the way he struggled to fit into a society that demanded conformity. At school, Alexander was anything but an ordinary student. Teachers described him as restless, impatient, and easily distracted. His brain injury had left him with difficulty focusing on lessons, and his stutter made class participation embarrassing. Other children mocked him, calling him slow or strange. Where some students blossomed under peer attention, Alexander recoiled deeper into himself. Every insult, every rejection added fuel to the fire of resentment growing in his mind. By this point, Alexander's love for chess had blossomed into obsession. His grandfather had taught him the intricacies of the game, but Alexander took it further. He spent hours studying positions and strategies, imagining endless possibilities of attack and defense. For him, the board was more than 64 squares. It was a battlefield where he could reign as commander. On the chessboard, he was not mocked or ignored. He was in control, moving pieces with confidence and precision. But when his grandfather passed away, the stability chess gave him became unmoored. Though Alexander continued to play, the loss of his mentor left a gaping wound. His mother, though present, could not provide the same guidance. She was busy working and surviving the difficult realities of Soviet life, and Alexander slipped further into emotional solitude. His isolation made him vulnerable to violent impulses. With no close friendships, no nurturing family ties, and no meaningful outlets for his frustrations, Alexander began experimenting with cruelty. Like many future killers, he turned first to animals. Neighbors would later recall that stray dogs disappeared near the Pichushkin household. Alexander would lure them, harm them, and watch with fascination as life left their bodies. To him, these acts were not crimes but lessons. Lessons in dominance, lessons in what it meant to control the boundary between life and death. Even in these early experiments, Alexander revealed the cold calculation that would define his later murders. He was not killing in rage, he was killing to feel power. Each death was a move in a larger game, and Alexander liked to imagine himself as the master of it all. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was approaching collapse. By the late 1980s, shortages, political unrest, and economic instability shook daily life. Crime was on the rise, and authority seemed weaker with each passing year. Alexander absorbed this chaos like a sponge. For someone already feeling detached from human empathy, the disintegration of order only confirmed his belief that the world was unpredictable, dangerous, and ultimately meaningless. As a teenager, he struggled socially. His classmates went on dates, played sports, and dreamed of careers, while Alexander was left behind, awkward and isolated. He became known for sudden outbursts of anger. One insult could send him into a violent rage, his fists flying before anyone knew what was happening. Teachers saw him as a problem child. Classmates feared him but also ridiculed him, reinforcing his feelings of rejection. And yet, beneath the surface, Alexander was already developing a philosophy of life that separated him from everyone else. He began to see people not as individuals with feelings and value, but as objects like pawns on his chessboard. To him, most human beings were expendable, replaceable, and insignificant. Only their usefulness in his game mattered. This worldview deepened when he entered early adulthood. By the time the 1990s arrived, Alexander was living in a Russia transformed. The Soviet Union had collapsed in 1991, and the country plunged into economic turmoil. Poverty soared, unemployment spread, and crime syndicates dominated the streets of Moscow. For many, these were years of desperation. For Alexander, they were years of opportunity. In a world filled with chaos, his inner darkness had room to grow unchecked. He was now a young man with little direction. He held odd jobs, drank heavily, and continued to brood over his place in the world. His social life was minimal, his relationships shallow. But one obsession remained: chess. Not the friendly matches in parks or clubs, but the deeper metaphor it provided. He began to link the game with his fantasies of control and death. Each square represented a life. Each move represented a kill. He dreamed of creating his own chessboard of murders, filling each space with the memory of a victim. It was during this period that Alexander's fantasies began to solidify into something more concrete. No longer was he satisfied with imagining or practicing on animals. He wanted the real thing. He wanted to test his power on human beings. He wanted to move from theory to action. But his descent into murder did not happen overnight. First, there was the long, slow erosion of empathy. Second, there was the reinforcement of violence as a solution. And third, there was the belief that he was destined for something greater, that his killings would make him unique, remembered, even legendary. He began to study other Russian killers, most notably Andrei Chikatilo, the butcher of Rostov, who had murdered more than 50 women and children. Chikatilo had been caught and executed in 1994, but his name lived in infamy. For Alexander, this infamy was not a deterrent. It was an inspiration. He wanted to surpass Chikatilo. He wanted to be the next great name in Russia's bloody history of murder. And so, by the early 1990s, Alexander Pichushkin was no longer just the troubled boy with a head injury and a chess obsession. He was a man preparing to take his first steps into killing. He was sharpening his skills, refining his fantasies, and searching for the right moment to make his first move on the board of death. What had begun as childhood trauma and loneliness had evolved into a dangerous philosophy of life. And when he finally acted, the city of Moscow would have no idea that one of the most prolific killers in its history had just begun his game. By the time Alexander Pichushkin entered his 20s, he was no longer just a socially awkward young man struggling with anger and rejection. He was now a man with a dangerous obsession, one that had taken root during his lonely childhood and was blossoming into something far darker. Isolation had shaped him, but obsession was beginning to define him. His obsession was not only with chess, but with what chess represented: control, strategy, and the calculated domination of one opponent over another. In his mind, life itself was a game, and people were nothing more than pieces. Some were pawns, easily sacrificed and forgotten. Others, like knights and bishops, might play a greater role, but they too could be eliminated. The only figure that mattered on his board was himself, the king. This philosophy was not merely theoretical. It had already begun to influence his actions. His fascination with violence had grown beyond harming animals, beyond fantasies. He started to imagine in vivid detail what it would feel like to end a human life. Not in a moment of rage, but deliberately, methodically, as if moving a piece on the chessboard. He craved not only the act of killing, but the power it would give him. The feeling of being above others, of holding their fate in his hands. For Alexander, this desire was not about hatred. It wasn't personal. He did not need to despise his victims. He saw killing as a form of artistry, an accomplishment, a way to prove his superiority over ordinary people. In his own twisted logic, murder was not a crime. It was a calling. In the early 1990s, Russia was going through a transformation that only fed his impulses. The collapse of the Soviet Union had left society fractured. Law enforcement was underfunded, overworked, and often corrupt. Crime rates soared. Murders, robberies, and disappearances became part of daily news. For many people, the fear of crime was overwhelming. For Alexander, this chaos was encouraging. It meant that killing could be done more easily, more quietly, with less chance of being caught. And so, his thoughts began to dwell more and more on his future as a killer. He envisioned himself as a figure of destiny, someone who would not only surpass Russia's most infamous murderers, but also leave behind a legacy unlike any other. Where others killed randomly, Alexander wanted a system. He wanted structure, and that structure would come from chess. He developed what he called the chessboard plan. It was simple in concept, terrifying in reality. He would kill 64 people, one for each square on a chessboard. Every victim would represent a move, a step toward completion of the game. For him, this was not merely about numbers. It was about control, mastery, and the symbolic power of achieving what no other killer had done. In his fantasies, the completed chessboard would be his monument, proof of his brilliance and his ability to manipulate life and death as if they were mere game pieces. This idea consumed him, pushing him further into obsession. Yet, Alexander was not reckless. He was careful, calculating, and patient. He understood that in order to fulfill his plan, he could not draw unnecessary attention to himself. He studied how other killers had been caught and vowed not to repeat their mistakes. He realized that targeting strangers, homeless men, alcoholics, vulnerable people, would make it easier to avoid suspicion. These victims would not be missed by society, and their disappearances would rarely trigger intense investigations. Still, beneath the calculation, there was another side to his obsession: arrogance. He began to believe he was smarter than everyone else, smarter than the police, smarter than society itself. He saw himself as playing a game that no one else even realized was happening, and that gave him an intoxicating sense of superiority. But obsession has a way of demanding action. Thoughts alone were no longer enough for Alexander. He had to act. He had to test himself. He had to make his first move. And so, in the early 1990s, he began to cross the line from fantasy to reality. His first known murder would not make headlines. It would not even be remembered by many outside of his eventual confession. But for Alexander, it was everything. It was the moment when his obsession became his identity, when the pieces began to move across the board of death. He invited a childhood friend, someone he trusted, on a walk. They shared vodka, talked, and seemed like any other two young men spending time together. But Alexander had other plans. As the alcohol loosened his friend's guard, Alexander struck. With a sudden act of violence, he killed him, his first human victim. What followed was not fear or guilt. It was exhilaration. He later admitted that killing gave him a feeling unlike anything else. A rush of power, a sense of completeness, an addictive high that no drug or drink could match. In his words, a life without murder was an incomplete life. From that moment, there was no turning back. Alexander was hooked. His obsession was no longer confined to his imagination. It was real, and it demanded to be fed. Each kill, he believed, would bring him closer to completing his chessboard, closer to achieving his vision of ultimate control. But he was also patient. He knew he couldn't kill recklessly. He had to build his record carefully, methodically, one move at a time. He would learn from each murder, refine his methods, and ensure that he could continue for as long as possible without being caught. This patience was not weakness, it was strategy. Just as in chess, Alexander knew that victory did not come from rushing, but from thinking several moves ahead. He saw himself as a grandmaster of murder, and every life he ended was just another piece falling to his genius. And so, the lonely, angry boy who had once been mocked in school and abandoned by his father had now become something far more dangerous. He was a man with a plan, an obsession that consumed him, and a future filled with blood. The world did not yet know his name. Moscow did not yet know the terror that lurked in its parks and streets. But Alexander Pichushkin knew. He knew that his game had begun, and he would not stop until the board was complete. In the shadow of Moscow's towering apartment blocks and winding courtyards, Alexander Pichushkin prepared to take the most important step of his life. By 1992, he was 18 years old, drifting without a clear future, consumed by his fantasies of control and death. The collapse of the Soviet Union had left the city unsettled, crime rising, and authority weakened. For Alexander, it was the perfect environment in which to act. He had dreamed of murder for years. He had rehearsed in his mind countless times what it would feel like, how he would do it, how he would savor the moment. But imagination was no longer enough. To prove to himself that he was different, that he was destined for something greater, he needed to act. He needed to kill. His first victim would not be a stranger, but someone he knew well, a childhood friend named Mikhail Odidechuk. Choosing someone familiar was risky, but for Alexander, it carried a certain meaning. This was not just about ending a life. It was about crossing a threshold. He wanted his first murder to be unforgettable, something etched into his mind as the start of his journey. On an otherwise ordinary day, Alexander invited Mikhail to join him for a walk. The two young men carried bottles of vodka, a common pastime in post-Soviet Moscow. They drank together, laughed, and reminisced. To Mikhail, it was just another outing. But to Alexander, every word, every sip, every step was part of a plan. As the alcohol took effect, Alexander guided his friend toward a secluded area. It was here, away from prying eyes, that he revealed his true intention. In a sudden and brutal act, Alexander struck his friend and killed him. The details would later emerge in his confession, but what mattered most was not the method. It was the result. For the first time, Alexander had taken a human life. The moment was transformative. He would later describe the act of murder as a rush unlike anything else, a surge of power and satisfaction that filled him completely. In his own chilling words, life without killing felt empty. For him, this was not an act of rage or revenge. It was not about hatred. It was about proving to himself that he could do it, and discovering that he wanted to do it again. But the aftermath of his first murder was not what Alexander expected. Michael's disappearance did not go unnoticed. Family and friends raised questions, and eventually the authorities became involved. Within days, suspicion began to fall on Alexander himself. After all, he had been one of the last people seen with Mikhail. Faced with the possibility of being caught before his game had even begun, Alexander panicked. The police investigated, questioned him, and dug into the case. But in a twist of fate, the authorities failed to find enough evidence to charge him. Without solid proof, the case collapsed, and Alexander walked free. For him, this close call was both a warning and a revelation. He realized that killing someone he knew carried too much risk. If he wanted to continue his journey, he would need to change his strategy. He could not afford to draw attention to himself, not yet. His dream of filling the chessboard would require patience, calculation, and victims who would not be missed. And so, for the next several years, Alexander retreated into silence. His fantasies remained strong, his obsession with the chessboard plan never wavered, but he understood the danger of acting too soon. He waited, observing the world around him, learning from the mistakes of others. He drank heavily, drifted through jobs, and lived a life that appeared aimless to those who knew him. But inside, his mind was anything but aimless. It was plotting, planning, waiting for the right moment to strike again. During these years, he followed the news of other Russian killers. He studied the fate of Andrei Chikatilo, who had been executed in 1994. Chikatilo's downfall was a lesson in arrogance, sloppiness, and leaving witnesses could bring even the most prolific killer to justice. Alexander vowed he would not repeat those errors. He would be smarter, more disciplined. He also spent more time wandering Moscow's Bitsa Park, a sprawling, wooded area on the southern edge of the city. To most people, it was a place for picnics, walks, and quiet reflection. To Alexander, it was the perfect hunting ground. Its dense trees and secluded corners offered privacy, while its proximity to urban neighborhoods ensured a steady flow of potential victims. In the years to come, Bitsa Park would become infamous as his killing field. Though he had stopped for a time, Alexander never abandoned his vision. He believed he was destined to kill, destined to complete the chessboard. He saw himself not as a criminal, but as a creator of something grand, something unique. The memory of his first murder haunted him, but not with guilt, rather with hunger. He wanted to feel that rush again, that intoxicating sense of power, and eventually he would no longer be able to resist. The first murder in 1992 had changed everything. It was the spark that ignited a fire that would burn for years. Though he paused to protect himself, the obsession only grew stronger. The game had begun, and Alexander Pichushkin was determined to play it to the end. After his first murder in 1992, Alexander Pichushkin had crossed a line that could never be erased. He had tasted the feeling of ultimate control, the power to decide whether another human being would live or die. And once that feeling had been experienced, there was no going back. But the aftermath of that first killing had also left him cautious. The police had come dangerously close to linking him to the disappearance of his friend. For a young man still learning how to hide his tracks, it was a warning. If he was reckless, he would be caught before he even had the chance to begin his grand plan. So, in the years that followed, Alexander slowed down. He withdrew into himself, drinking heavily, drifting through meaningless jobs, and burying his violent urges beneath a mask of normality. But this was not a surrender. It was a pause, a preparation. All the while, his obsession with his chessboard plan grew stronger. He dreamed of the 64 squares, each one filled with the memory of a victim. He saw it as his life's mission, his ultimate masterpiece. Other killers murdered without order or purpose. He, however, would kill with structure, with design. He was not just a murderer, he believed. He was a strategist, a grandmaster of death. By the mid-1990s, Russia was a nation in turmoil. The Soviet Union had fallen, and the country was still struggling to rebuild itself. Poverty was rampant, crime was widespread, and alcoholism was destroying countless lives. Moscow was no exception. Its streets were filled with desperate men and women, many of them homeless, addicted or forgotten by society. For Alexander, these people were perfect prey. They could be lured with promises of vodka, companionship, or simple conversation, and if they disappeared, the world would barely notice. No police task force would be launched. No journalists would write headlines. To him, these were pawns, expendable, easy to sacrifice, ideal for filling the squares of his chessboard. By the late 1990s, he began killing again. His methods were deceptively simple. He would approach a victim, often a homeless man or a lonely alcoholic, and invite them to join him for a drink. Vodka was his weapon of choice, not for killing, but for disarming. A bottle of cheap liquor was enough to gain trust, enough to bring down defenses. Once his victim was drunk and vulnerable, Alexander would strike. His favorite weapon became the hammer. Brutal, efficient, and silent, it allowed him to deliver deadly blows to the back of the head. With one or two strikes, his victims collapsed lifeless. To ensure death, he sometimes shoved a vodka bottle into the open wound in the skull, a grotesque signature that marked his killings. For Alexander, this act was more than just murder. It was ritual. It was a way of combining the lure and the kill, the temptation and the punishment. To him, the vodka bottle symbolized weakness, the victim's willingness to be manipulated for alcohol, and he wanted that weakness to remain part of their death. His chosen hunting ground was Bitsa Park, a sprawling green expanse on the southern edge of Moscow. By day, it was filled with families, joggers, and chess players. But by night, its wooded corners became a dark labyrinth of shadows and silence. Alexander knew the park well. He knew where to lure his victims, where to strike, and where to leave the bodies. And the bodies began to add up. One after another, men disappeared into the night, never to be seen again. Officially, authorities recorded some cases as unsolved disappearances or alcohol-related accidents. Few saw a pattern. After all, these were not prominent citizens. They were the forgotten, the vulnerable. But for Alexander, each body was a square on his mental chessboard. He kept track carefully, counting and recounting, reminding himself that he was not killing randomly. He was building something greater, something only he could understand. During these years, his arrogance grew. He did not see himself as a criminal, but as a superior being. He once admitted that killing made him feel like God. To take a life, to watch the spark fade from someone's eyes, was to experience ultimate power, and he wanted that feeling again and again. Yet Alexander was not without control. Unlike impulsive killers who lost themselves in frenzy, he remained methodical. He chose his victims carefully, avoided leaving witnesses, and spaced out his murders so as not to draw too much attention. To the outside world, he was just another quiet man living in Moscow. Inside, he was building a record of death that would one day make him infamous. By the year 2000, Alexander Pichushkin was no longer just a troubled loner. He was a predator, one of Moscow's most dangerous. Though the police still had no idea what was happening in Bitsa Park, the number of victims had already reached staggering levels. The chessboard was far from complete, but the game was well underway. The rise of the chessboard killer had begun quietly, almost invisibly. He killed those the world did not care about, using methods that left little evidence, in places where darkness offered cover. But with each victim, his confidence grew. He knew he was getting better, smarter, more efficient. And he also knew something else: the pawns were only the beginning. Soon, he would no longer be satisfied with the forgotten and the nameless. Soon, his ambition would drive him to kill more openly, to take greater risks, to push his game further. The city of Moscow still had no idea. But in the quiet corners of Bitsa Park, under the shadow of the trees, the chessboard killer was sharpening his strategy. The opening moves were finished. The middle game was about to begin. By the dawn of the new millennium, Alexander Pichushkin was no longer just a man who killed to satisfy dark impulses. He was now a man driven by a mission, a purpose he believed would set him apart from every other murderer in history. His plan was simple in concept, but chilling in reality: to kill 64 people, one for each square on a chessboard. In his mind, the chessboard was not just a metaphor. It was a structure, a goal, a sacred symbol of his power. Each victim was a piece, each death a move. He kept track carefully, marking the progress of his killings, determined to complete the game. For Alexander, this was not just about numbers. It was about proving his superiority, about showing that he could accomplish what no one else dared attempt. By 2001, his methods were refined, efficient, and terrifyingly effective. He had perfected his approach. First, he would lure victims by offering them vodka and companionship. For many of the people he targeted, homeless men, alcoholics, and the lonely, this simple gesture was enough to win their trust. They believed they were sharing a drink with a friend. In reality, they were walking into a trap. The setting for many of these murders was Bitsa Park, a massive stretch of woodland on the southern edge of Moscow. By day, the park was a place of leisure filled with families, couples, and chess players. But by night, it transformed into Alexander's hunting ground. Its dense forests, hidden paths, and dark corners offered him privacy. Once he had chosen a spot, he would lead his victim there, often under the pretense of continuing their drinking session. Then, with brutal precision, he struck. His weapon of choice was the hammer. A single blow to the back of the head was usually enough to incapacitate, sometimes to kill instantly. But Alexander did not stop there. To ensure his victims could never recover, he often shoved a vodka bottle or stick into the wound, a grotesque signature that became one of his trademarks. For most killers, one or two murders might leave them shaken, fearful, or remorseful. For Alexander, it was the opposite. With every victim, his hunger grew. The act of killing was addictive. It gave him a rush, a sense of completeness, a thrill he could not find anywhere else. He once said that life without murder was like life without food, empty, meaningless. And so, he killed again and again. Between 2001 and 2005, the bodies began to pile up. Officially, investigators would later confirm 49 victims. though Alexander himself claimed the number was higher, closer to his goal of 64. Each killing was another move on his mental chessboard, another square filled. Yet, despite the frequency of the murders, Alexander remained invisible to the authorities. His choice of victims played a major role in this. Many of the people he killed were marginalized, forgotten by society. When they disappeared, few noticed. Families were absent, friends were non-existent, and the police often dismissed the cases as drunken accidents or natural causes. The bodies found in Bitsa Park raised suspicions, but the sheer size of the park and the lack of witnesses made it difficult to connect the dots. For Alexander, this invisibility only fueled his arrogance. He believed he was smarter than the police, untouchable, destined to finish his game without interference. He saw himself as a master strategist, moving unseen while society remained blind to the horror unfolding in its midst. But he was not content to remain in the shadows forever. As his confidence grew, so did his ambition. He began to take greater risks, targeting not only strangers but also people he knew, co-workers, acquaintances, and even women he had met. To him, these were not friends or neighbors. They were pieces on the board, no different from the others. One of the chilling aspects of his psychology was his lack of remorse. When questioned later, he admitted that he often felt happier after killing, more alive, more complete. For Alexander, murder was not just an act, it was a necessity, a vital part of his existence. By 2005, the fear in Moscow had begun to grow. Though the public did not yet know the full scope of the killings, word spread of bodies found in Bitsa Park. Rumors circulated of a killer stalking the woods, preying on the vulnerable. Police investigations were launched, but without clear evidence or suspects, progress was slow. The authorities had no idea that the man they sought was hiding in plain sight, blending in as just another resident of the city. During this period, Alexander often returned to the park even when he was not hunting. He walked the paths, studied the terrain, and relived his crimes. To him, Bitsa Park was not just a location, it was his arena, his personal chessboard where life and death played out according to his rules. As the number of victims climbed, Alexander's obsession with reaching 64 became stronger. He spoke openly to himself about his mission, convinced that it was his destiny. To outsiders, he appeared strange but harmless, a quiet man with a passion for chess. To those who knew him more closely, there were hints of something darker: his violent temper, his fascination with death, his lack of empathy. But few imagined the scale of what he was doing. Between 2001 and 2005, Alexander Pichushkin established himself as one of the most prolific killers in Russian history. Each murder brought him closer to his goal, each body another step toward completing the chessboard. But the very arrogance that had kept him going, the belief that he was untouchable, would also plant the seeds of his downfall. For years he had preyed on the forgotten, the nameless, the invisible. Now, he was beginning to kill people who would be missed. People whose disappearances would not go unnoticed. And that meant the game he believed was his alone was about to be interrupted. The opening moves had long passed. The middle game was in full swing. But soon Alexander Pichushkin would face the endgame, and in that endgame, the hunter would become the hunted. By 2005, Alexander Pichushkin's reign of terror had already spanned more than a decade. The forested paths of Bitsa Park had become his chessboard, littered with the remains of men and women who had crossed his path. 49 lives had been confirmed stolen by his hammer, but in his own words, the number was closer to his sacred target of 64. Each life lost was another square filled, another move played in his deadly game. But like any chess match, as the board fills, the risks grow higher. And for Alexander, the final moves would prove more dangerous than the first. For years, his choice of victims had shielded him. The homeless, the addicted, the lonely. These were people whose absences stirred little concern. Their lives had been invisible, and so too were their deaths. But by 2005, that pattern began to shift. The chessboard killer's hunger was no longer satisfied with the forgotten. He began to select victims who were closer to home, people with jobs, families, and connections. This change marked the beginning of his downfall. One such case was the murder of his co-worker, Marina Moskaliova. Marina was not a stranger picked up from the street. She was a woman who worked alongside Alexander, someone known to her family, someone whose disappearance would not be brushed aside. When Alexander invited her to Bitsa Park for what seemed like an ordinary walk, she accepted, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps out of trust. What Marina did not know was that Alexander had already marked her as his next move on the board. As always, he carried his hammer. As always, he lured his victim into a secluded area. And as always, he struck with cold precision. Marina's body was left in the park, her skull shattered, her life reduced to another Tali and Alexander's private game. But this time, Alexander made a mistake. Marina had left a note for her son, telling him where she was going and with whom. She mentioned Alexander by name. When she never returned home, her son went to the police. For the first time, authorities had a direct link between a missing person and Alexander Pichushkin. Still, even with this evidence, Alexander continued to kill. His arrogance had reached a peak. He believed he was untouchable, that no matter how many bodies were discovered, the police would never catch him. After all, hadn't he already outsmarted them for years? To him, Marina's death was just another move, another step toward 64. During this time, his methods became even more brutal. He no longer cared about hiding his crimes or concealing evidence. He wanted the world to know he was killing. He wanted recognition, fame, infamy. He wanted to be remembered as more than just another murderer. He wanted to be immortalized as a grandmaster of death. The police, however, were finally beginning to see the pattern. With Marina's case as a starting point, investigators began connecting the dots between the bodies found in Bitsa Park and the strange disappearances in Moscow. What had once seemed like random incidents now formed a chilling picture. A serial killer was at work, and he had been active for years. Still, Alexander kept going. Between 2005 and early 2006, he continued to lure victims into the park. Each time, he repeated his ritual vodka conversation, trust, then the hammer. Each time, he claimed another life, filling another square. He was so close to his target of 64 that he could almost see the completed board in his mind. Yet the net was tightening. Police surveillance increased, patrols around Bitsa Park grew more frequent, and suspicion against Alexander mounted. But he refused to stop. He once said that stopping would be worse than death, that life without murder was meaningless. And so, even with investigators closing in, he pressed forward. The arrogance of his actions in these final months was staggering. Unlike his early years, when he carefully chose isolated victims and left little trace, he now murdered people whose families would immediately report them missing. He left behind clues. He risked being seen. It was as if he wanted to be caught, as if the attention he had been denied for so long was now something he craved. For Alexander, the murders were no longer just about filling the chessboard. They were about proving his superiority, proving that he could defy the law, society, and morality itself. Each kill was a taunt, a challenge to the world to stop him. But every challenge has an answer. And Alexander's answer would come in 2006, when Marina's murder and the evidence she left behind would become the decisive move in the game. As the police closed in, Alexander continued to walk the paths of Bitsa Park, hammer in hand, eyes scanning for his next victim. He believed he was still in control, still the master of the board. But in reality, the endgame had already begun. The hunter was about to be exposed. In his own words, he once claimed that murder was his life, that killing gave him joy, power, and purpose. But as 2006 drew closer to his capture, that joy would transform into arrogance, and that arrogance into mistakes. The chessboard was nearly full. The pieces were almost all in place. But the final move would not belong to Alexander Pichushkin. It would belong to the law, to the families of his victims, and to the investigators who had finally seen the truth. For the first time, Alexander was about to face a game he could not win. By the summer of 2006, Moscow was no longer blind to the horrors of Bitsa Park. Too many bodies had been found, too many families had reported missing loved ones, and too many whispers had turned into undeniable truths. A predator was at work in the city, one unlike any Russia had seen before. And while Alexander Pichushkin still believed he was invincible, the walls were closing in. The murder of Marina Moskaliova was the turning point. She was not just another anonymous victim. She had a son, a family, and most importantly, she had been careful. Before leaving to meet Alexander, she had written a note to her son. She was going to walk with Sasha, the nickname for Alexander. That small detail, a name scribbled in a mother's hurried handwriting, was enough to change everything. When Marina never returned home, her son went to the police with the note. For the first time, investigators had a concrete lead, a name, a person to watch. And so, the quiet, strange man who often lingered in Bitsa Park was no longer invisible. He was now a suspect. The police began to follow him. They watched his movements, tracked his routines, and studied his habits. Day after day, Alexander returned to the park, as if drawn to the scene of his crimes. To him, Bitsa Park was his kingdom, his chessboard, his hunting ground. But to the police, it was now a trap. On June 16, 2006, the trap was sprung. That day, Alexander walked into the park with another victim. He carried his hammer, his chosen weapon, hidden beneath his coat. But what he didn't know was that surveillance officers were already watching him. They saw him lead the man into the woods. They saw him prepare to strike, and then they moved in. Alexander was arrested before he could deliver the fatal blow. The hammer was seized, the intended victim rescued, and the chessboard killer's reign of terror finally brought to an end. At first, Alexander was calm, even arrogant. In the interrogation room, he showed little fear. Instead of denying his crimes, he seemed almost proud of them. He confessed freely, speaking of the murders as if they were achievements, as if each life taken was a point scored in his personal game. He admitted to 49 murders with certainty, but he claimed the real number was higher, closer to his goal of 64. He described how he had chosen his victims, how he lured them with vodka, and how he killed them with his hammer. He even detailed the grotesque ritual of shoving bottles into the wounds of their skulls, explaining it as a way to mark them, to finish the kill with his own twisted signature. The investigators were stunned. Rarely had they encountered a killer so open, so unashamed, so utterly devoid of remorse. Alexander did not speak like a man burdened by guilt. He spoke like a man bragging about victories, eager for recognition. In one chilling moment, he told police, "For me, life without murder is like life without food. I felt like the father of all my victims. Since I killed them, I also had the right to control them." For to him, Murder was not just killing. It was creation, power, even love twisted into its darkest form. He compared himself to God, holding the power of life and death in his hands. The police, however, were not interested in his philosophy. They wanted evidence, and Alexander gave it to them. He led investigators back into Bitsa Park, walking them through the woods, pointing out the places where he had struck down his victims. One by one, he revealed the sites of his murders, like a tour guide showing landmarks in his personal empire of death. Forensic teams scoured the areas, uncovering bones, clothing, and remnants of the lives he had destroyed. Each discovery confirmed his confessions, turning his chilling words into undeniable truth. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Alexander Pichushkin was one of the most prolific serial killers in Russian history. His arrogance, his obsession with numbers, and his lack of remorse made him a figure of horror and fascination. The media quickly seized on his story, dubbing him the Chessboard Killer. The nickname spread across headlines, capturing the macabre nature of his crimes. In custody, Alexander seemed almost pleased with the attention. He smiled during interrogations, answered questions with confidence, and sometimes even mocked the investigators. He wanted the world to know who he was, what he had done, and why he believed he was special. For the families of the victims, his words were unbearable. Each confession was a reminder of a son, a daughter, a father, or a friend who would never return. The scale of his crimes left scars that stretched far beyond the park where he had hunted. But for Alexander, the endgame was simple. He had been caught, yes. But in his mind, he had already won. He had filled nearly every square on his chessboard. He had left behind a legacy of fear, a record of death that could not be erased. Even in defeat, he believed he had achieved his goal of immortality. Yet, the final moves were no longer his to play. Now the justice system would decide his fate. The trial was coming, and with it, the chance for Russia to see the full extent of the horror he had inflicted. For more than a decade, Alexander Pichushkin had controlled the board. Now, the board controlled him. The chessboard killer had made his moves, but in 2006, the game had ended, not with his victory, but with his capture. And as he sat in his cell, awaiting the trial that would expose his crimes to the world, Alexander showed no regret, no sorrow, no humanity. He remained proud, even defiant. To him, he was not just a murderer, he was a master. But the world saw him for what he truly was, a monster. By 2007, Russia was preparing to witness one of the most disturbing trials in its modern history. The man who had haunted the shadows of Bitsa Park, who had confessed to nearly 60 murders, was finally to stand before the law. His name was now infamous Alexander Pichushkin, the chessboard killer. From the moment the trial began, it was clear that this would not be an ordinary courtroom drama. The case was unprecedented in scale. Never before had Russian prosecutors faced a killer who claimed such a staggering number of victims. And never before had the public been so captivated, horrified, and unsettled by the details of a single man's crimes. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Families of the victims sat in silence, waiting for answers, waiting for justice. Journalists filled the benches, their pens ready to capture every chilling word. Police officers, hardened by years of service, remained on edge, as if even in chains Alexander could still strike. And then there he was, calm, expressionless, almost smug, dressed neatly with his hair combed. He looked less like a monster and more like an ordinary man. But behind his eyes, the darkness remained. He carried himself not with shame, but with the arrogance of someone who still believed he had outplayed the world. The charges against him were staggering. Prosecutors accused him of murdering 49 people and attempting to murder 3 more. Each count was read aloud, each name a reminder of the lives that had been lost. For hours, the courtroom listened as the list of victims unfolded, one after another. The weight of it was overwhelming. When asked to respond, Alexander did not deny the charges. Instead, he corrected them. He insisted that the true number of his victims was higher, that the official count of 49 did not do him justice. He claimed that he had killed at least 60, perhaps more. To him, the trial was not about defending himself. It was about recognition, about making sure the world understood the full scale of what he had accomplished. The prosecutors presented evidence, forensic reports, autopsy findings, witness testimonies, and most damning of all, Alexander's own confessions. Video recordings showed him calmly walking investigators through Bitsa Park, pointing to the places where he had killed, describing the methods he had used. There was no remorse in his voice, no hesitation. Instead, he seemed almost proud, as if giving a lecture about his craft. One of the most chilling moments of the trial came when Alexander spoke directly to the court. He explained that murder was essential to his existence. He compared killing to breathing to eating. He said that life without murder was unbearable, that each death gave him strength and satisfaction. He spoke not like a man on trial for his life, but like a teacher explaining a simple truth. The families of the victims listened in horror. Some wept silently, others stared at him with hatred, but Alexander remained unmoved. Their pain meant nothing to him. Their tears were irrelevant. For him, they were just part of the game, pieces on the board that had already been removed. Psychologists were called to testify, and their conclusions were disturbing. Alexander was declared sane. He was not insane, not delusional. He knew exactly what he was doing. He understood right from wrong, law from crime. He simply chose murder. This was not madness. It was evil in its purest, coldest form. The defense tried to argue that he was mentally ill, that no sane person could kill so many without remorse. But the evidence was overwhelming, and Alexander himself undermined their arguments by proudly embracing his crimes. He did not want to be excused. He wanted to be remembered. As the trial dragged on, the media dubbed it the trial of the century. Each day, headlines spread across Russia, detailing his confessions, his arrogance, his complete lack of humanity. The public followed every word, shocked not only by the number of murders, but by the calmness with which Alexander spoke of them. Finally, after weeks of testimony, evidence, and confessions, the jury returned with its verdict. Alexander Pichushkin was found guilty of 49 murders and 3 attempted murders. The weight of those words filled the courtroom. For the families, it was justice, though incomplete. For Alexander, it was confirmation of his infamy. When asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, Alexander smirked. He reminded the court once more that the real number of his victims was higher, that he had killed closer to 60. He wanted the record corrected. Even in defeat, his pride remained. On October 29, 2007, the judge delivered the sentence life imprisonment, with the first 15 years to be spent in solitary confinement. It was the harshest punishment available under Russian law. There would be no possibility of parole, no escape, no chance for freedom. Alexander Pichushkin would spend the rest of his life behind bars, locked away from the world he had tormented. As the sentence was read, the courtroom erupted. Families wept, some in relief, some in grief. Journalists scribbled furiously, recording the final chapter of the trial. And Alexander, he remained calm, expressionless, almost amused. For him, prison was not a defeat. He had already achieved what he wanted: recognition, infamy, a place in history as one of the most prolific killers of all time. But outside the courtroom, the world saw him differently. He was not a grandmaster, not a strategist, not a genius of death. He was a murderer, a monster who had taken innocent lives for his own twisted pleasure. His name would be remembered, yes, but remembered with horror, not admiration. The trial of Alexander Pichushkin ended with his imprisonment, but the scars he left behind would remain forever. Families still mourn. Bitsa Park still carried its shadows, and Moscow still whispered about the man who turned murder into a game. For the chessboard killer, the game was over. But for Russia, the memory of his crimes would never fade. When the courtroom doors closed in October 2007 and the sentence was handed down, Alexander Pichushkin's fate was sealed. Life imprisonment, no possibility of parole. The first 15 years to be spent in solitary confinement. For a man who had once roamed free in the vast woods of Bitsa Park, choosing victims at will, the walls of a prison cell became his new, permanent world. In those first years, solitary confinement stripped away everything he had used to feed his ego. No victims to manipulate, no chessboard of death to fill, no audience for his confessions. Just silence, steel bars, and the echo of his own thoughts. For most prisoners, such isolation breaks the mind, but Alexander was different, often smirking when asked about his past. When journalists managed to secure interviews, he spoke openly about his killings, never showing remorse, never expressing guilt. To him, prison was not the end of his story. It was simply another chapter, another stage where he could remind the world of who he was, the chessboard killer. He remained proud of his body count. He frequently insisted that the number of his victims was higher than the 40, 9 confirmed in court. Even in chains, he clung to that vision. For the Russian prison system, Alexander was a high security inmate. He was watched carefully, kept under strict control, and never allowed opportunities that might enable escape or further violence. His life became a strict routine: meals, confinement, occasional exercise, and nothing more. The freedom to stalk, to choose, to kill, everything that once gave his life meaning, was gone forever. And yet, he adapted. He spent his time reading, writing, and speaking when permitted, often revisiting his old philosophies. He continued to describe murder as essential, comparing it to food, drink, or love. He insisted that without killing, his life was incomplete, as though murder was not just an act, but his very identity. To the end, he never showed regret for his victims, only regret that he could not continue. Outside the prison walls, Alexander's legacy cast a long and terrifying shadow. The Russian public struggled to process the sheer scale of his crimes. Parents warned their children about Bitsa Park, even years after his arrest. And so, the chessboard killer plays no more moves. His game is over. The final piece has been taken. Yet the board remains as a reminder, not of his genius, but of his horror. In the end, Alexander Pichushkin wanted to be remembered. He wanted the world to know his name, his plan, his chessboard of death. And indeed, he is remembered, but not as he wished. He is remembered as a symbol of evil, a man who chose murder over humanity, and whose legacy is nothing more than a monument to cruelty. Behind prison walls, he may still smirk, still speak of his victims, still cling to his dream of 64. But outside, the world sees him for what he truly is. Not a grandmaster, not a creator, not a god, just a killer.